Hey everybody, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Andy Grove said, "The ability to recognize that the winds have shifted and to take appropriate action before you wreck your boat is crucial to the future of an enterprise." Well, on today's episode, we talk about inflection points, how to spot them before they happen, how to decide what to do about them, and more. My guest is a wife and proud mother of two delightful grown-ups, a best-selling author of 5 books, a longtime professor at Columbia Business School, a sought-after speaker and advisor, and a recognized expert in leading innovation and growth. She's a podcast host, one of the world's top 10 management thinkers, an award-winning academic researcher, and was named by Fast Company magazine as one of the 25 smartest women to follow on Twitter. Her list of clients includes GE, State Farm, Ericsson, Prudential, Colgate-Palmolive, and so many others. Please welcome the woman who's helping us see around corners so we can see uncertainty in business as an opportunity and position ourselves for success, Rita McGrath. Rita, it is great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure. Well, I am so excited about our conversation today. So let's dive right in. I thought a good starting point would be for you to share with us if I were to ask a few of your Columbia students to share, let's say 2 or 3 words to describe you, how do you think they'd respond?
Energetic, uh, uh, smart. I think they probably would say that. And, practical.
And practical. Interesting. Okay. All right. Very good. I like that. I might have to follow up with 1 or 2 of them to see if they share in those responses, but I love that. So what is your personal favorite thing about yourself and why?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I would say the fact that I'm continuously curious about the world, and when something strikes me as out of line or unusual, I really enjoy getting into what makes it work that way.
Excellent. And have you always been that way, or is that something that you have developed more over time?
I think it's always been part of my life. To understand where that comes from, so both of my parents were scientists.
Mhm.
My mother was a microbiologist and my dad was an organic chemist. And so our house, the dinner table conversations, would often be about something that was unusual or changing in the world or that they'd noticed. And, the answer was inevitably found in a book somewhere. And so I think from a very young age, I was, had a lot of experience questioning why things were the way that they were.
Interesting. So, did you have siblings?
I have one brother, he's younger.
And around the table, so that with having parents that were PhDs and following that line of curiosity, give us an example, if you can think back, of what kinds of questions may have come up at the dinner table.
Well, I'll give a specific example. My dad was working at Xerox for a number of years, and he was one of the people that was privileged to fly out to Xerox PARC, the famous Palo Alto Research Center. And he would come back with stories of this thing called a mouse and graphical user interfaces and how computers were going to be such a big part of our future. And my brother at the time, who was a bit of a geek, would benefit because my dad at the time, there was no such thing, as a personal computer back in those days. But what there were corporate sort of computer lending programs. And so my dad would be able to occasionally bring one home, and my brother could kind of play with it and do some very primitive programming. And so there was always a lot of conversation about what the new technologies were really going to mean.
Wow. That is so interesting. So what is one of the most valuable lessons that you learned from both your parents? Let's start with your mom. One of the most valuable lessons that you learned from your mother could have been something personally, professionally, but something that you have carried with you through the years.
Oh, well, I think she was relentlessly independent in a whole variety of things. So she could wield a hammer, she could mow the lawn, she could, of course, do her lab work. And I think she came of age in a period where there wasn't an expectation she would marry. She grew up in post-World War II Germany, and most of the men her age were no longer around. So I think she felt very self-reliant and passed that on. Now, I guess I grew up with a bit of a misunderstanding because I thought that's how women were. I just took it for granted that that's the way things were. And then you grow older and you go into a society that, at the time was still pretty gender divided, and discover there's a whole different layer of complexity to that. I mean, I think that was very interesting.
Very interesting. So let me ask you the same question about your father. What was one of those valuable lessons that you took away with him that still resonates with you today?
Oh, yeah. So I remember one day, it was just the two of us, and we were at the Mark Twain house, which was where I grew up. That wasn't too far away. It was one of the houses where Mark Twain had spent a good chunk of time. And as we finished the tour of this house, we got to the end and you get to the bookstore, right? And there were a couple of books about Mark Twain that I hadn't read. And I was just so entranced at the thought of getting into them. And I begged him and begged him. And he said, "Oh, I never could resist a good book." And that certainly stayed with me ever since.
I love that. It's funny. I was not a reader as a child. I just shied away from it for whatever reason. And once I discovered the joy of reading and learning, which I don't even want to tell you when that happened, but let's just say it was later. But when it finally did, I just had an insatiable appetite, and I had a lot of years to catch up that I had missed. And now you look around my studio, my office, there's always 5 books that I'm in the middle of. So it's interesting. So I feel you on that. That's a good one. So first of all, thank you for sharing that. I'd like to stay back in time a bit because I'm curious. I have, just in my own experience and the people that I tend to work with, I find that there are situations, there are experiences or moments in life that happen that can often define us. They can often change the course of our lives. What is one of those moments that you've experienced?
So I was in the public service for a number of years. And the dilemma with being in the public service is that your career just skyrockets for the first, 8 to 10 years, and then it plateaus after that. So unless you decide you want to be a career civil servant, you need to do something different. I remember having a conversation with my husband, and at the time, we were just on the brink of becoming new parents, and talking about, what would I do? And the decision was to apply to get a PhD in business, which at the time it was a booming sector. And the universities were being put under considerable pressure to have people that were academically trained in the MBA classroom. And I'll never forget, I did my applications, our son was born. I was actually with our son, who was a baby, with my mom. And the phone rings, and my husband said, "Oh, there's an envelope here from the Wharton School, which is UPenn, their business school." And he said, "And it's a fat one."
Ooh. So that changed the course of your life, or certainly was one of the impetuses that changed the trajectory of your life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Very, very interesting. So Walk us through your career trajectory, if you will. I think it's important to give some context because in my own research of you, it's really interesting to see the different directions that you've taken. And I think it's also important to point out to everyone, and I'd love for you to share this too, that in addition to being in academia, you obviously have experience as an entrepreneur too. And so I want to talk about that and share that career path. So please do share.
Sure. So I went to school, my undergraduate degree at Barnard College in New York City, and became really interested in the political process. So I became a political science major. I ended up with a master's in public administration, and then right around then started a little business, which my partner and I very vaingloriously called it a political consulting business. It was very simple business. We did things like direct voter mailing preparations and postering for campaigns and stuff like that. And the first year we actually did really well, and we made the kind of stupid mistake that you make when you're doing something for the first time and you're very young. We sort of forgot elections didn't happen every year. So year two, we're looking at each other going, well, now what do we do? So then that morphed into, at the time, you would have called it something like a Kinko's business. So it would be like typing, word processing, that kind of thing, located around college campuses. And we had a really defining moment when a friend volunteered that he thought he could get us a $100,000 SBA loan. Now, back in the day, that was a lot of money. And I had one of those sort of dark weekends of the soul and realized that I'd gotten into this business because the first business, which was around my passion for politics in the public fora, hadn't really worked out, and that I didn't really want to be in the typing word processing business. So I handed that one over to my partner, and I took a role with the City of New York government, and I was in progressively more demanding roles there. And we were embarking back then on what at the time we called it computerization. Today we would call it digital transformation. That's really what it was. But it was the early days of all that. And then reached this turning point when I decided, the future of that trajectory just didn't feel to me as though I would really be living up to my potential. I went and did a PhD at the Wharton School in Philadelphia, and there signed on to the Snyder Entrepreneurial Center there, where I met a man who subsequently became my mentor and my PhD thesis supervisor, Ian McMillan. And we also, at the time, got a $300,000 grant, a 3-year grant from Citigroup to study their corporate venturing program, to do case studies about their corporate venturing programs. And that was a really lucky break, because what we were able to do was talk. They gave us basically unfettered access, and they gave us a person to liaise with. And we constructed these case studies of, I want to say something like 33 ventures, both that had gone well and that had gone badly. And from that came up with a model, which we call the City Ventures model. And they used it very aggressively for quite a long period of time. But that really gave me the bug for corporate ventures. So did my thesis, developed a model for how companies create new capabilities. And I was all set to spend another year at Wharton. I'd raised the money for a postdoc, and I was going to hang out there. And then I got a call from a good friend of mine, Ming-Jir Chen, who at the time was in the strategy group at Columbia. And he said, hey, we've got a role this year. I don't know that we'll have a role next year, so why don't you come and give a job talk? And, if nothing else, it'll be good practice. So I said, well, fine. I had my dissertation done. So I was in a very fortunate position. I wasn't like some people go on the market all but dissertation, which is awful because you have to spend your first year finishing your thesis and learning to teach and. So I had it all done, went and gave the talk. I was Columbia's number 2 candidate. Their number 1 candidate took a job elsewhere, and they made me the offer. So I've been at Columbia Business School since then, basically.
That's amazing. Now, you've written a number of books. Now, you had your first number of books were with a co-author. Was the co-author Ian McMillan?
Yes. Yeah, the first 3 were with him.
Okay. All right. And what was that experience like, being able to bring books like that to life and working together to do that?
It had high points and it had low points. One of the low points was he wrote like 2 pages and said, "Okay, there's my contribution to this chapter." And I said, "That's not a contribution. Those are notes. We need a written out chapter." He said, "Yeah, but you type much more quickly than I do." And I was like, "No, dude. Well, like this is not happening." The first book we did together was called The Entrepreneurial Mindset. And we were actually solicited to write that book by Harvard Business Press, by Harvard Business School Press. It's since been renamed the Harvard Business Review Press. And up to that point, we'd been writing a bunch of different Harvard Business Review articles. And the press felt that there was an appetite in the market for a book that would get into those topics in more depth. So that was the first one. It was called The Entrepreneurial Mindset. Then we got really interested in this phenomena that, companies were finding growth opportunities in markets that, you looked at them and you go like changing loose change into some other form of currency, or making bubble wrap, or, coming up with bespoke packaging. I mean, really kind of boring little parts of the economy. And yet companies that were getting this right were doing really, really well. So we did a deep dive into that. And that became a book which we subsequently called Market Busters. And it was all about these specific moves you could make as an organization to uncover growth opportunities. And that book, to this day, it's just full of checklists and little strategies you can use. And if the first one doesn't use, there's dozens more. So that was Market Busters. And then we were asked to write a book length treatment of our what's now a pretty famous article called Discovery Driven Planning. And we wrote a book called Discovery Driven Growth together. And that was great, except the book called Discovery Driven Growth was published in 2009, which happened to be the year following the Great Recession of 2008. And nobody was buying books with growth in the cover.
Timing.
Yeah, right. Timing is everything. And then I decided it was time for me to do some things on my own. For a variety of reasons, not least of which being anytime you write with a fairly well-regarded other person, there's a tendency for them to get the credit, especially if it's a woman and a man.
Okay.
So I thought it would be important to write something on my own. And that was where my book, The End of Competitive Advantage, was written from. And then my most recent book is called Seeing Around Corners, How to Spot Inflection Points in Business Before They Happen. And I'm working on a new one, which has to do with what I'm calling the permissionless organization. And the idea is, how do we create organizations where hierarchy is kind of light, and decision-making gets pushed to the edges as much as possible, and they're good places for people to flourish, where people can really bring themselves fully to work and thrive in an environment without being, mashed down by the algorithms.
So to that point, and we're going to come back to seeing around corners here in just a moment, but at what phase are you in writing this book, and what is your anticipated release date?
Sure. So I don't know if your listeners know what writing a book is usually like, but there's the initial stage, which is usually culminating in a proposal. And then depending on whether you decide to go with an agent or whether you have a direct relationship with a publisher, there's a whole lot of discussion about, does a publisher want to pick it up? In this case, I adore my editor at Harvard Business Review Press, so I decided to go straight to them. Their acquisitions committee approved it. So where I am now is the proposal consists of a bunch of stuff about you and your platform, but it also gives you like one fully developed chapter and then summaries of all the others. But so by the time you're done with the proposal, you've got the structure for the book, and now it's kind of filling in that overall structure with more detail. So where I am at the moment is one pretty well fleshed out chapter, and then I'm busy digging into the subsequent chapters.
Excellent. So you would anticipate at this point, if you had a goal in mind or a target date, let me back up a moment. I have the good fortune of speaking to a number of authors, and it's interesting to hear about the process of writing, of bringing a book to life, and to hear how much time it takes to actually, from inception, writing, to publishing the book. And I've heard all kinds of numbers. I spoke to an author about 2 weeks ago who it takes 7 years on average to bring a business book to life. Now, that's this particular author. So for you, based on your experience, what has it historically been for you, and what are you anticipating for this new book?
Well, I think lapsed time. But don't forget, we're not full time on the book. I mean, I've also
Right.
got a teaching load, and I've got a side job, and so I'd say lapsed time for me. It's somewhere between 2 and 3 years from the time I
Okay.
get the core of an idea. But what's hard about, at least to me, about a good business book is a really good business book has a deep, deep, interesting core idea that the rest of the book kind of wraps around. And I think that's getting to that is often the most time consuming part. And I think a book has to have that to work for me anyway, because if you don't have that, you're kind of writing just a series of articles, or it really is just a big article, and there's not a lot more to it. So I think a really good business book has a challenging core idea, and then the idea itself has to be rich enough that it can play out in terms of context, examples, applications, and then what does it all mean to the reader.
Excellent. So, did you see yourself as a writer early on? Did you have a sense that this was a direction that you were going to go?
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole academic training prepares you to write. I mean, you write really dense articles with phrases like asset mass discontinuities in them, but it's writing nonetheless. And I always, from the beginning, had an interest in reaching out to what I would call an executive or practitioner audience. So I would write, just even as I was writing articles for Strategic Management Journal or Academy of Management Review, I'd also be publishing in the Harvard Business Review. I'd be talking to executives about what they saw as challenging situations. And then when HBR came to us and said, "Hey, we'd love to get a book length treatment," I thought, well, why not? And so I would say that's always been part of my academic identity. Where I
Okay.
would say there's a difference between people who are just academics who really just want to write about their research and not reach out to executives. So that's where the books come in. That tends to be a market that likes books. They like to see that a publisher has been willing to invest with you. They like to see that the ideas are carefully developed. And so if you want to reach out to an executive audience, that's part of the process.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. So let's talk about seeing around corners here. I want to speak about the book dedication before we actually dive into the book.
Mhm.
One of the things that hit me is you mentioned in the dedication that in one of your last conversations with your mother, she said, "I'm proud of you." And it surprised you. It seemed like it surprised you how much those words matter to you. And you mentioned that they mattered a lot.
Mhm.
I'm curious, why did "I'm proud of you" matter so much coming from your mother?
Well, as I mentioned, she was an incredibly accomplished woman. I mean, her work in bacteriology and microbiology is still being cited. I mean, she was incredibly influential. And to have it be one of the last things she wanted me to know, that to make sure that I knew, I thought that was deeply moving,
Hmm.
really deeply moving. And I don't know about your relationship with your parents, but they know you, right? So they're not particularly impressed by awards and medals and all the other stuff. They
True.
they, they remember the cluttered rooms and the the less than stellar things that happened at school and all that. And so to really say that at the end of her life was, I thought it was just deeply moving.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for sharing that. It took me back for a moment because I know that in my own life there were many times where I really wanted that validation. I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but I wanted to hear that, and there were times when I didn't hear it, and of course, we can go down a rabbit hole, and I felt bad about myself. I felt like I didn't live up to the potential that my parents had for me in that moment. And so when I read your note, it kind of took me back to some of those memories that I had in my youth and through growing up and really looking for that "I'm proud of you," those words.
Mhm.
So let's dive into seeing around corners, and this is really it's a great book that we are certainly going to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the book. We'll provide links, obviously, in the show notes. But you break the book down into 3 or 4 big sections, if you will. And I wanted to talk about first what some of the common triggers are for an inflection point. If you can share some of those with us and what an inflection point is. So if you're speaking to an audience that's maybe hearing this for the first time, or maybe they're not familiar with the term, first, what is it? And then let's talk about the common triggers.
Sure. So an inflection point is something that happens typically externally to your organization that changes something by a factor of 10. So it allows you to move 10x faster. It allows you to be 10x less expensive. It allows you to be 10x more convenient. And if you get it right, it can take your business to new heights. And if you get it wrong, it can cause your business to lose relevance and eventually go into decline. And the reason inflection points are so interesting to me is that when they finally emerge, right, when everybody's recognizing it and can talk about it. So, it's November of 2022, and now we have Chat GPT, and the ordinary person can access large language model trained AI. Oh my God, the world is different. It feels like that, right, when it actually happens. But if you go back and look in time, what you will find is that if you structure your attention appropriately, you can actually see the signals that an inflection point is on its way, getting stronger and stronger. And so you can be prepared. Now I can't, timing is always tricky. If I could predict timing, I'd be a billionaire. But you can sort of say at some point, this is highly likely to be an event. And then you can test your strategic robustness, your decisions, your investment in preparation against those strategic possibilities.
So give us an example of a business that has done very well at being able to recognize those signals, right? Being able to see around corners, and how that's been able to benefit that organization. And then let's take the flip side of that and give us an example, if you will, of a company that absolutely missed the signals and what the ramifications have been.
Sure. So one of the examples I love of an organization that kind of regularly picks up on inflection points would be Amazon. And they operate very differently from the way many firms operate. And specifically what they'll do is they'll think about a trend or something that's moving, and they'll think about it in a 3 to 5 year time slice. And then instead of saying, I'm going to start with where I am right now and project forward into that time, they start in the future and work backward. And that is I can't tell you how powerful that is. So let me give an example of that kind of behavior. So they had a venture into phones, which was an absolute disaster. It was called the Fire phone, and nobody wanted it. But out of that disaster, they were able to rescue the technology that subsequently became the Alexa voice recognition system. And so they thought there was something really valuable about auditory communication with computers, that was a big trend, that we weren't just going to want to type, we were actually going to want to communicate with our tech verbally. And so they said, well, how do we do something with this? So they started out by contracting with a manufacturer to make basically inexpensive speakers. So these are like $39 or $49, the low end of the market. So they're not competing with, Bose and Sonos and those guys at the high end. And all these speakers were equipped with Alexa, and the functionality was the kind of thing that sort of said, Alexa, set me a kitchen timer for 10 minutes, right? So that was sort of move number one. And they only sold these things to Prime members. But what they're doing now is they're laying out the user base, right? They're creating a group of people who now own these devices, and they're now using Alexa for really ordinary tasks, right? So the next thing they did was they taught Alexa some tricks. So they got some developers to write some, silly little things like, Alexa, tell me my horoscope for today. Alexa, do I need boots? Simple little apps. But they demonstrated now that these speakers, coupled with Alexa, could actually use voice to control what an app did. The next thing they did was they made test kits for developers, and they made them available for free. And so all these developers are looking at Alexa. They're going, oh, wow, new market. They've now got enough of a user base that it becomes interesting to the developer community. And these developers start building apps for Alexa using the, free kits. And so now Alexa's getting smarter and smarter at this. They're getting better and better. And so as a user, as a buyer, you see, oh, wow, it can tell me recipes. It can give me real-time traffic information, whatever. It's starting to become a lot smarter. Now, with the developer community, you understand that they've got limited time, like all of us. And so there's only a limited number of platforms they're going to develop for. So when other companies come to the developers and say, hey, could you develop something for us? They'll say, hey, we've got this whole capability built up on the Alexa platform. Why don't you use that? So the next phase of this whole thing was works with Alexa. And then, they'd established such a strong position by then that when companies like Samsung or others wanted to use voice in their equipment, basically Alexa gets specced in now. So through this path, right, they've got their technology now embedded in other people's gear, which gives you, a large installed base, and it allows you to position yourself for whatever happens, if we do decide that talking to computers is going to be our preferred mode of interaction, which it very may well be with the advance of AI and everything, they're in a really well-positioned space.
And then, so that's a great example of a company that has built a culture around seeing around corners, right? That's able to look forward thinking, that's able to anticipate trends, and is willing to take risks and accepts failure as part of their culture, because that's a learning opportunity, right? That's how they learn and how they become better. So let's take the other side of the coin. What would be an example of a company that you know of that absolutely did not see around the corners and therefore suffered the results of that?
Well, I think retail in the United States is a great graveyard hunting zone for companies that missed it. If you take something like J.C. Penney's, right? And J.C. Penney's was a great brand for, solid products. You could count on them. They had their perennial little sales, which made people feel that they were on a treasure hunt. They had the great big book that you could choose from. And it was really built for the American, middle class, right? That was where you knew you would get a good price. You knew you'd get a decent quality item. And Penny's was like your reliable friend. But one of the things that Penny's didn't see, if you will, was, I guess, two things that they didn't see. The first one was the rise of real income inequality in this country, which meant that you had growth at the low end of the market. So those are the kind of people that would shop at like TJ Maxx or Discounter or the dollar store, and growth at the top of the market, which was, Bloomingdale's or Nordstrom's or a high-end market. And Penny's part of the market just started to get hollowed out. And they didn't really adjust their mix or their marketing or their sort of couponing to address it. And so their board made this kind of Hail Mary decision to hire Ron Johnson from Apple, who is very famous for having built the Apple retail stores. And he tried, as it turns out, very unsuccessfully to bring Penny's up market. So fancier goods, slightly higher prices, kind of a weird advertising campaign where he said to the loyal JCPenney shopper, "Oh, you can look better than that," right? Sort of, I don't know, like criticizing them almost. But he redesigned the stores, and it was a disaster. And they've basically been trying to recover ever since. But to me, the inflection points there are this sort of change in the shape of who the shoppers were. And then, of course, the whole digital e-commerce way of connecting and communicating with customers really radically shifted.
So, how do we, as those that are listening that are executives in corporations, how do we get better at seeing those trends, being able to anticipate or look for those signals? Because they're there, but if we're not focused on them, if we don't know what we're looking for, then we're certainly not going to see them. And then we're going to run into situations like a J.C. Penney as an example. What can we do to be better dialed in to pay attention to those signals?
Well, I think the first big challenge for most of the executives I talk to is making the time for it. They're all busy. They're up to their uxters in email and meetings and travel, and so it feels like you're wasting your time by doing this. There's no kind of tangible output that comes out of it. So I think the first thing you've got to get in your brain is this is not something that you can do in the 15 minutes in between meetings. This is going to take time. Now, not vast amounts of time. And this is the part that they don't understand. It's maybe, 2 hours every couple of weeks that I'm looking for. So that's the first observation. Second observation I would make is they are often incredibly well tuned in to some of these trends. They read about them or they've heard about them, or, over lunch somebody mentioned something or they heard something on the news, but they never take the time to really sense make together about what the cumulative impact of these trends could be. So in a workshop setting, what I'll do is I'll say to them, okay, let's look at two big uncertainties that might have a big impact on your business. So I did this recently for a pharmaceutical firm. And one of the things they were thinking about was, well, is the future of the doctor's office going to be digital, or is the in-person doctor visit going to continue to be the first line of contact with the medical system? And then the second big uncertainty they were worried about was what's going to happen with the nature of payment. Is it going to continue to be fee for service, where we just get paid for every pill or injection or whatever it is we sell, or is there going to be some other way payers are going to want to cover their patients? Are we going to get paid by keeping people healthy? And in that scenario, right, then the role of the pharmaceutical company becomes one of many, many, many players who are all having to contribute to keeping these patients healthy. So what we did was we took those two uncertainties, posited two future values of each, and made a 2x2. And what's interesting about this exercise, and trust me, you can do it. I mean, it helps to have a skilled facilitator, of course, but you can do this in a couple of hours. And what we did was we posited 4 radically different futures. Now, why that's valuable for executives is, as human beings, we're kind of programmed to start with where we are, and we project linearly out into where we could be. And that served us really well when the biggest risk we had was like being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or something. I mean, your goal at that point is to go from where you are to the nearest tree and hope the tiger can't follow you. As human beings in a complex system, though, that linear projection is really problematic because we're not seeing a range of possibilities. So what this exercise gets executives to do is they can say, oh, I can actually see how these 4 different futures could really unfold. And I can mentally prepare myself for what would have to be. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this to me is I went into it thinking, oh, I'm going to be like Debbie Doom here, and it's like apocalyptic and it's an inflection point and your whole industry is going to change. I have found it to be completely the opposite. Once you can name it, once you can say, hey, this is something that may happen, but it also may not happen. What would you do in that case, right? And people get very energized by that. All of a sudden, it's not so scary. You've named it. You've said this could happen. And you're creative people. You're ingenious. What would you do? So then what I do, so that's like the initial setup of some of this work. And then what I do is I say, let's each story has a headline that goes with it, right? So 50% of our office visits are now done telemedicine-wise, right? And then you work backward from that story and say, well, okay, if that was to be a future that's possible, what would have to be true before that could happen, right? So you'd be looking at things like are Medicare and Medicaid and other payers going to reimburse for digital doctor's visits? Are we going to see changes in legislation that uh, privilege, did some form of digital delivery? Are we going to see, for example, continued devolution of what needs to be done in a doctor's office? So if you think about it, why do you have to go to the doctor physically? Well, obviously they need to look at you and see how you are, but a lot of times it's because there's equipment in the office that's just too expensive to have at home. So hopefully you don't have an MRI machine in your living room, and hopefully you don't have to use it on a regular basis. I mean, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. You have to go to the radiology place and use it. But what's happened as technology's evolved is more and more of that kind of equipment is actually coming home. So you can do an EKG by yourself at home now. You can inject yourself with incredibly expensive cancer medications at home. In other words, things that used to have to be done in an in-person clinical setting are now being dispersed. And that's only going to get faster as we start to see telecommunications. So what started to happen now is these guys are getting excited. They're like, yeah, I can see that happening. And, oh, I picked up that egg. So then what you do is you set up a little, call it a foresight council, and they meet, as I said, 2 hours a month, maybe. And each person in that council is looking after a couple of indicators. These are early warnings of what could be happening. And your job there is just to report out, just to sort of bring us all up to the same level of where are we in the progress towards these things. And then once it passes a critical threshold, that's when you start talking about, well, are we at the stage now where we need to start doing something about it?
So if we can back up for just 1 second, when you're workshopping this and you're looking at these different futures, if you will, are we looking at a 5-year time horizon? Longer?
That's up to
shorter?
Well, that's up to the company. That's up to the company. If you're in high tech or media or something where every day is different, right? You probably are looking at a 18 to 24 month time horizon. If you're in aircraft engines or something that really does have a much longer life to it, you're probably looking at 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so industry and business specific, and then who would you, based on your experience, who do you recommend would be sitting around the table? Who within an organization needs to be involved in these conversations?
Well, the key thing here is diversity. Right? You want diverse perspectives. You want more senior people and less senior people. You want people with different relationships to your front line. So I'd include a couple of people who regularly come into contact with customers. I'd include people who are from different functions. So why not have somebody from operations in there? Why not have somebody from finance in there? So the other thing that you can do if you're doing one of these workshops, and what I do ahead of time, is I do a bunch of interviews with a whole diversity of people. So you come in already with some of the generative work of, hey, what are you seeing is happening out there already started. You're not starting from a cold start. So I interview a broad swath of people. I definitely talk to people on the front lines, talk to people in R&D, talk to people in outside, at universities about tech that could be affecting this firm. And so you kind of bring into the room a fair amount of data. Now, I will say there are futurists who do a much heavier, deep dive on deep technology trends, and they do, 10, 20-year forecasts and everything. And I think in certain circumstances, that's actually what you need or what you want. I think where my process really works well is when you got like extremely busy execs who they need enough of this to spend time on it, but they can't spend months on it. So they need to be able to get a quality result with a relatively light investment of time. If you're thinking of making billion-dollar, irreversible commitments, you may want to go with the heavier process.
That makes perfect sense. What is in your experience, what would be the biggest roadblock for an organization to actually move forward with a workshop or an exercise of this nature? Because you mentioned about the time factor, right? There has to be a commitment of time. Is that a big one? Is it a matter of the commitment of people and resources? What is it?
Well, for the kind of workshop I'm describing, for most companies, it's a pretty low bar. It's a half day and then a series of follow-ups. So, that's most companies don't have trouble with that. I would say the biggest obstacles are a sense of lack of urgency. Right, we're doing really well. Why should we be worried about this stuff? We're succeeding brilliantly already, so I really don't need that, right? Or a sense of what's the right word? Things are starting to soften. The signals aren't looking so great, and I just don't want to see it. I'm just in denial that things really are kind of changing in a fundamental way. I say those are probably the two biggest.
Well, you just hit on two huge factors and I just want to speak to that lack of urgency, or thinking that, oh, we're doing really well, we're successful, we've got this figured out. That to me is one of those opportunities where we need to look at challenging our assumptions, because that's an area that clearly can get you in trouble if you become lax because you think that you're at the top of your game. You're ripe for disruption.
I would completely agree. And we've seen this over and over in history. We saw it with Xerox. I mean, Xerox owned the market for plain paper copiers for decades, and then became very defensive about protecting that market. Everybody knows about companies like Kodak, but we're seeing it more recently, examples like Google, right, where once the hegemony in advertising gets challenged, now everybody's sort of circling the wagons and going into defensive mode, rather than saying, okay, wait a minute, that is a legitimate threat. What are our next couple of things? But I'm working with them, trying to help think through, like, what does that look like? So I think they are doing a lot of the right things. But, that very first sort of crisis reaction to ChatGPT was, whoa, we're being challenged in a very meaningful way. But that got rid of the sense of lack of urgency for sure.
Absolutely. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question, but in terms of the work you do on the academia side and being a professor at Columbia, how has ChatGPT impacted the work that you do? Do you embrace it in terms of what students are able to do and how they're incorporating the use of generative AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's important is to be a knowledgeable consumer. So, the analogy I would make to generative AI is if you go all the way back in human history, like prehistory, and think of literacy, where you could read something on a piece of paper and it would speak to you. It would be like a living thing that would speak a language. Well, most of humankind back in the day was illiterate. They had no way, communication was passed person to person, and there was no way of learning information or capturing a story or, capturing a procedure without a person telling you and showing you, right? That was the norm. And then along come these people, monks and people who were literate, and it was magic. I mean, this was how did you look at that piece of paper and suddenly you knew how to cook a stew or hunt a bear or whatever? How did you do that without someone telling you? So it was an extraordinary capability when you think about it. Early versions of literacy, and I think in many ways ChatGPT is one of those moments for us right now where the people that are learning and mastering it and using it, we're looking at them and we're just going, this is extraordinary. This is so different, but we'll learn. Human beings are ingenious creatures. We will learn. And that's what I try to tell my students and colleagues, which is it's very early days yet, right? We're just learning the alphabet. But as it gets better and we get better, we're going to get better at figuring out what sentences are and where we're going and all that. And I think in my personal life, I've used ChatGPT to save me time. So I'll give you an example. I was doing a paper with Ram Charan on what's happening with globalization, right? And my research into globalization, I used to do a whole bunch of it. It's gotten a little rusty. So set up an inquiry. It said, give me some of the leading works that people cite a lot on globalization. And it gave me back 5 or 6 books. Now, I'm not going to take its word for it. I'm going to check my sources and I'm going to make sure, it wasn't hallucinating when it proposed this to me. But it saves me the time of having to now search, in our university library systems using keywords and fighting my way through all the stuff that's not relevant to find the stuff that is. It just cuts out that bit of grunt work time. So I've used it a lot for that. I would never use it for writing. I would never use it for writing. It's you can tell. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, you
Um,
you can most definitely tell. I think it's interesting how now you're able to train it to let's say I'll just use the term speak your language. So how you would typically write, you can train the technology to be able to write in a similar voice. Now, I haven't used that yet, but I have certainly used it in a similar fashion to what you just said, right? For research purposes, it prompts for using prompts for writing, for newsletters, etc. So, but I'm encouraged to hear that you're embracing the technology, and I love your description.
well, and I'll give you an example. An author friend of mine, Charlene Lee, she's really way ahead of me for sure. She's done all kinds of amazing things with AI. And one of the things she's able to do is she's able to make an audible recording of one of her works. Let's say it's a book. And using AI, it's able to instantaneously or virtually nearly instantaneously translate that work into 200 different languages spoken in
Wow,
her voice. Isn't that amazing? So, but just think
incredible.
if you're an author of the reach that that gives you and the ability to. So, let's say you're doing a project in Indonesia, and Indonesia itself has something like 300 languages. So, to be able to custom tailor your message in a way that it can be received by people who would have been locked out of your world before. I think that's just wow, isn't that
It
amazing?
is. That truly is amazing. So, Rita, obviously we have only been able to scratch the surface on your most recent book, and I'm so excited to hear that you're in the process of writing another book as well. And for all of you that are watching and listening right now, there is so much depth to seeing around corners. I would highly encourage you to go out and purchase a copy of this book. Again, we're going to provide links in the show notes. So, Rita, as we are wrapping up our conversation today, a couple of things. First, I would love it if you would share with us what are maybe one or two bigger questions that you're asking yourself today. Obviously, one of them has to do, I'm sure, with the book that you're writing and the research behind that. But if it's not, what is something that you're contemplating today? Bigger questions.
Well, I have a startup. It's called Valise.com is the website. And its job in life is to help companies with this piece of the innovation transformation process when you've got a bunch of ideas, but they're not yet ready for being part of the core business. So what is that journey like? And we've developed some software that we're beginning to be happy with how it is, and I hope to be using that with companies and just seeing how, if I could introduce, here's the hypothesis, if I could introduce a tool that made that part of the innovation or transformation process transparent and accessible and trackable, and I could capture the history and I could capture the stories, that organizations would be able to be that much percentage better in doing those processes. Because right now it's a struggle. I mean, I'm sure you see it with your clients. So that's a big project that I've been working on for a while, and I'm very excited about where we are with it.
Outstanding. That is so good. So I would love it if you would leave our audience with a challenge. What would you challenge all of us to do?
I would challenge you to do something unfamiliar that is a growth opportunity, whether it's business related or not. So something that would force you to use that part of your brain, which is, the lizard brain that's just kind of asleep all the time, but sort of provoke you into using that. Because what we know is it's surprise and it's effort that stokes imagination and that creates that sense of mastery. So I would challenge you every day to do something. It doesn't have to be a big thing, but something that really pushes you to try something new that would stretch that muscle.
Yeah, that's perfect. What a great challenge. Well, I definitely intend to take you up on that one. I know our listeners are going to do exactly the same thing. And Rita, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and getting to know you a bit better. And I cannot
Thank you.
wait to see how things progress for you and the additional wonderful work that you put out into the world. I'm grateful for you and thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It is my pleasure. And for all of you, thank you so very much for watching and for listening. And I do have a quick favor to ask. Would you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, leave us a review on Apple Podcast. Let us know what is one or two key takeaways from this particular conversation with Rita McGrath. And to enjoy more episodes, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com. Hit that podcast button. And until next time, keep learning, keep growing. Do make sure you pick up a copy of Seeing Around Corners, and also subscribe to Rita's Thought Sparks newsletter. You're going to love this. We didn't talk about this on the podcast, but you're going to love this newsletter. And we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.